Hello, I'm Emily Mateless and welcome to the Big Read Book Club. I'm so thrilled that my book, Airhead, The Imperfect Art of Making News, is this year's Big Read book. I really hope that you're enjoying it and that you enjoy these book club talks, which will look at some of the stories from the book in more detail. And the events within these pages are, I guess, some of the most funny, challenging, significant or changing of my career, and it is a huge thrill and a compliment to me to know that you'll be discussing them. I hope you find the talks interesting. Best of luck.
So I just got to stop sharing screen. There we go, jolly good. Well, there, a special message from Emily Mateless. So now to turn to Fiona, who I'd like to introduce. So she's my colleague in the Department of Journalism, Publishing and Media. Fiona is the course leader for our MA Journalism course. She studied Arabic at Cambridge and then went on to train as a journalist on a local newspaper in Sussex. And from there, she went to the news agency Reuters and took postings in Nairobi, Baghdad and Beirut. And she said covering everything from conflict to coffee. She then went to work for the United Nations as a consultant editor. And before she came to Kingston, which was 5 years ago, she was the editor of Gulf States News. She's going to talk about the opening chapter of Airhead, which features the 2 a.m. call and how journalists always need to be ready to think on their feet. So welcome, Fiona. It's lovely to hear from you. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Alison, very much for that introduction. Yes, so welcome to all of you. It's nice to see familiar faces. I've seen a couple of names of students who are coming to join the MA, which is really nice, and others of you who hopefully we'll hear from in the discussion. So as it's the first week, I'm going to talk about the first chapter, as Alison says. It's the introduction. It's called the 2 a.m. call. And my plan is just to talk for about 10 minutes, quite briefly. I'm going to pick up on 2 main things that struck me as I read this particular chapter, and hopefully that can be the basis for discussion, or a starting point at least. So for anyone who hasn't read the book or who read it a while ago and has forgotten, this is a chapter. So the 2 a.m. call refers to a telephone call that Emily Mateless receives in the middle of the night. She's fast asleep. She's just come back after a fairly grueling assignment. And her editor rings and says that she has to go to Paris. So the reason he needs her in Paris is because there's been a series of coordinated terrorist attacks, and the one that you probably remember, this is in November 2015, was the one in the Bataclan theatre, a really horrific attack. And there were several attacks in the city that night, leaving sort of 130 people dead, I think the toll was, and lots more wounded, and she needs to get there to cover it. And this then leads to sort of an anecdote about how a couple of days later she's live on air and doesn't realise that she can be heard by the Newsnight audience, and accidentally just shouts out the word randomly migrants, and notes that that's probably the only thing about the broadcast that the many Newsnight viewers will remember. So that's kind of the backdrop. The first thing that I wanted to pick up on was, so there are lots of different types of news that are covered in this book, and some of them are a long time in the planning. So there are interviews that took weeks, months, sometimes even years to set up. And then there are other stories like this Paris story, which are what we would call breaking news. So something that happens that hadn't been planned, that comes out of nowhere. And I suppose my first point's a really obvious one, but worth thinking about, is that breaking news always comes out of nowhere. There is no way you can plan for it. So it's unforgiving, it's immediate, and you might be fast asleep, you might be in the wrong time zone. I've been in the wrong city, I've had to fly all night to get to places. There is no real time to prepare. The only time as journalists we really get to prepare when a story breaks and we need to cover it is the travel time. So as you run down the road, or as you jump into a car, or you take a train in this case, or sometimes an aeroplane, the journalist will be sitting there Googling frantically, trying to find out the latest death toll, to speak to their editor, asking what they need from them, when the deadline is, trying to find out the spellings of important names, that kind of thing. But there isn't really any time for reflection or planning, not much time to sort of make sense of what's going on. Which means, and I think there's a theme running right through the book, that in breaking news, especially in all journalism to a large extent, but logistics really dominate. So it's a job that's, part travel agent, part logistician. So the things that will shape your story are things like what access can you get? You know, where on the scene can you actually go to? Who is willing to talk to you within the very tight deadline that you need to operate? If you're working with television, there are lots of technical questions. Where can the camera set up? You know, where will the light be adequate? Where can I get the right white balance? All these kinds of things. As she says in this chapter, most of the outcome is not conspiracy, but cock up. You know, these are things that are determined by the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and the result is often circumstantial. Even if you move beyond the logistics, what we're being asked to do as journalists in breaking news situation is a really difficult thing. We're being asked effectively to put some kind of meaningful structure onto a story that is still unfolding. And again, she makes the point, it's really a bit too early to be doing that. Even with hindsight, some of these big events are very, very difficult to understand or make sense of. So what we're being asked to do is quite a complicated task. And that's not to say we don't know what we're doing. Although I'm sure there's a bit of that as well. We do know what we're doing, and that comes through training and through experience. You know, the reason we run the sorts of courses we do at Kingston, the MA and the undergraduate degree, are to train young journalists into how you react to things, whether that's a council meeting or a terrorist attack, which surprisingly, actually, as I've learned, certainly have a lot in common. It's the same sorts of steps, it's the same elements that need to go into a story. I covered my first terrorist attack in 2002. It was the Mombasa Bombings in Kenya. There was a hotel that was blown up on the coast, and actually I was in London when that happened, and I got the call. I'd arrived in London that morning 2 hours before, not having slept, and had to literally turn around, go straight back to the airport and fly straight back to Kenya. By 2004, a year and a half later, I was living in Baghdad, and by then, you know, this is where experience does tell. It had just become a sort of macabre routine, really. Every day in Baghdad, sometimes several times a day, we'd be sitting in the office, there'd be huge explosions. The first thing, you knew exactly what to do. The first thing you do was, how much did the building move? That tells you how close it is. Run up to the roof, scan the skyline, usually with binoculars. Can we see smoke? If we can see a plume of smoke, that tells us, you know, where it is in the city. Jump into a car and head towards it. So you learn these mechanisms, and you do know what to do. But it's a very fast moving situation. And of course, that's the other stupid thing about journalists and breaking news, is that when everyone else is sort of leaving the scene, we're heading towards it, as she notes as well. But yeah, the point that when you watch a newscaster covering a moving situation, or when you read a story in the online or indeed in a newspaper, don't forget that the journalist is probably exhausted and almost certainly unwashed as well. The second thing I wanted to pick up on, which is kind of linked to that exhausted, unwashed sentiment, is that while we are trained to know how to put a story together, while we are trained to know the elements that we need to gather in any situation to make the stories that we produce, what we're not really trained to deal with so well, and what doesn't really necessarily come through experience, is how to deal with the emotional side of these things. I thought it was really interesting in this chapter that even within just the Paris section, which is just a few pages, Emily Maitlis has cried or nearly cried twice. So the first time is that she's on the train, she's on the Eurostar on her way to Paris, and she receives an email that's sent, it's a generic email to all BBC reporters who are heading towards the city, towards Paris. And it asks them just to avoid a particular car. It's a black car with a particular number plate because it's thought to be used by the attackers and thought to be laden with explosives. And, you know, she's sitting on this train. She's absolutely exhausted. She hasn't slept very much in days. She hasn't seen her family in 2 weeks. She's hungry. She's wondering, what on earth am I doing heading towards this place? And it makes her cry. The other time she cries in Paris, or she wells up rather than actually cries, but is when a French reporter asks her, do you feel sympathy for this situation? You know, do you feel sympathy for Paris? And of course she does, and that moves her. And that's a theme that comes up elsewhere in the book as well. So when she's talking to Sheryl Sandberg, for example, about her bereavement, she feels a lot of compassion. And perhaps most poignantly, because for her, it's on her doorstep, and always harder to cover things when they're on your home turf, when she covers the aftermath of the Grenfell fire. And she asks at that stage a very poignant question. She says, how much as a journalist of myself should I take in, and how much should I leave at the door? And I thought that was a really interesting question. I think the answer is that we need to report with compassion, and it is possible, definitely, to report both with compassion and with accuracy. For me, if I look back on my career as a foreign correspondent, what stays with me most is those moments of emotion rather than the stories themselves. It's the the faces and the voices of the people that I met, which really are seared very deeply into my memory. For me, unlike in Airhead is a book, you know, most of the characters that we meet in this book are people who, you know, in fairly prestigious positions. So people like politicians, fairly senior politicians, celebrities, people of note. I've, you know, been lucky enough to meet my fair share of those as too. I mean, my career is nothing like as distinguished or as long as Emily Maitlis's, but nonetheless, I've had my, you know, fair share of importance encounters, as it were. But for me, actually, what stays with me more is the ordinary people that I met, who were struggling to deal with situations that were completely out of their control. You know, they hadn't asked for war to come to their town, or they hadn't asked for natural disaster or displacement or poverty or whichever difficult circumstance we were covering. My mind is full of, you know, people like an Iraqi businessman I met who had lost a leg because of negligence at the hands of the Americans in a field hospital, or the image of a small boy watching a dawn raid on his neighbor's house. You know, an Italian priest in Congo who'd spent 33 years there and spoke to me about unspeakable atrocities, but still managed to say it in such a soft-spoken way and still sort of retain his faith in humanity. And those moments when I felt compassion for the people who I was covering, I think are really important. If we want viewers or readers to care about the stories we tell as journalists, and presumably that's the aim, we'd like them to be interested, we have to connect them in some way to the people within those stories, and that comes from empathy, and empathy begins with the compassion of the journalist. So to that question, you know, which Emily Maitlis asked at Grenfell, how much of myself should I take in? I'd say you should always take yourself in. That doesn't mean your report has to be sort of mawkish or sentimental or hyperbolic. It's quite possible to be compassionate and yet retain a sort of sober tone and accuracy. I'm going to leave it there because I've spoken for just over 10 minutes, I think. Just two other themes that I want to just throw out there, rather, in case anyone wants to pick up on them, but that struck me as very interesting in this book as a whole. One is the relationship between journalists and power. So as I said, you know, a lot of the people that are interviewed, all the people really that are interviewed in this book are people of note, people with significant amounts of power. And I think that comes through. There aren't necessarily any answers, but there are a lot of questions around that come up in this book, whether it's Emily Maitlis's reaction, you know, rather adolescent reaction to Simon Cowell. She has this brilliant panic where she can't remember if she's kissed him first or he's kissed her, and she really worries about it. Or whether it's her sort of, you know, hushed awe at walking through the corridors of Buckingham Palace when she's on her way to interview Prince Andrew. So that sort of very interesting questions about how, as journalists, we respond to power, and how we, you know, again, that juggle between our human reactions to people who are big in a public life and our duty to hold them to account. I think that's very interesting. And also just more widely, the responsibility that we have to the people that we interview. Again and again, she seems to sort of ask herself questions about where her primary responsibility lies. You know, does it lie with the person you interview? Does it lie with your viewers? Or does it lie with, you know, some sort of bigger idea like the truth? So I'll leave it there. Happy to take questions on anything I've mentioned, anything I haven't mentioned, the book generally, journalism generally, anything you're interested in, whichever way you'd like to take the discussion.
Thanks very much, Fiona. That was fascinating. So I'll start off by asking you a couple of questions, and then if people would like to either put them in the chat or stick up their hand if they want to ask something. So the first question I've got is, I mean, it's always suggested to us that we shouldn't sleep with our phone in our room because it disrupts sleep. And in fact, actually, her phone is switched off, isn't it? So does she have a sixth sense about, I mean, it would have flashed the light, but do you, as a sixth sense, have that feeling that something's about to happen? Because she, in fact, looks at the phone before it starts ringing, doesn't she?
She hears it go off and then sort of ignores it actually until the morning. I don't think with breaking news you can have a sixth sense. It always happens. I mean, it breaks when you least expect it, and often in moments when you've sort of forgotten that something's likely to happen. I think that you get yourself, you know, you're in a state as a journalist who's covering breaking news regularly of knowing that it could ring at any time. So in that sense, perhaps you have a sort of, you know, hyper alertness. But no, I don't think you can know. And as you're heading, that sort of trepidation she feels on the Eurostar on the way to Paris, is part tiredness, part exhaustion, but it is also that sort of feeling of unknown. You don't know, you know that there's a big event, you understand already by that stage, you know, this is the morning after, that a lot of people have been killed and that it's going to be awful, but you never know exactly what you're going to expect. And you know, that feeling, I've done it countless times, especially in Iraq, in a car on a way to a bomb, and not really knowing exactly what you're going to find, and knowing that once you get there, you're going to have to hit the ground running. So I suppose you sort of, you know, if you're doing that kind of story regularly, you're in a frame of mind where you know the call could come, or you know, but no, I don't think we have a sort of sixth sense knowing exactly what's going to happen when.
But you have developed categorization skills, haven't you? I mean, I was quite chilled by your description of monitoring how much the building shakes and where the smoke is, so how far you are away from it. Does that spill over? I mean, do you ever switch off once you've developed all those skills of categorizing something?
I mean, I can't talk in general terms. For me, it depended very much where I was, sort of, you know, if you're living in London and being flown or trained, but traveling now and then to big events, you are able to some extent to maintain the distinction. You know that home is a safe place, and that, you know, you will travel to, you'll be parachuted in when there's a big event that you need to cover, which is why something like Grenfell or the London bombings was so difficult for journalists here to cover, because that infringes on your home turf. When I talk about Baghdad, that's a little bit different. I was based there, I lived within that environment, and yes, you have to learn in the same way that anyone who lives in a war zone knows. You know, you come to recognise, we used to lie in bed at night and hear shells, and you would know immediately if it was outgoing or incoming, because you have to know, because should I bother to get out of bed or not? You know, is this one where I have to sort of hide in the corner away from the windows, or can I just ignore it and go back to sleep? So that's kind of, that comes of living within a war zone for an extended period of time and sort of learning to adapt to it in the same way that civilians who live there have to. You know, anyone who spends long periods of time in conflict zones has to learn how to cope with them, and sort of how to get on with life as normally as you can, in the sense that, yeah, it's not very normal at all, but, you know, there's a different kind of normality that begins. So yeah, there is some kind of categorization. And as journalists, I suppose as well, the categorizations that we are trained to think, they are quite cold in some ways, but how big is the story? You know, how's this story going to play? What sort of, because that will affect the sort of coverage that you provide, the sorts of elements that you need to get together, that you need to gather to collect a story. Sadly, that will depend usually on death toll, how many people have been killed. You know, the more people that have been killed, the bigger the story generally. Also, it depends on lots of things like location. So, you know, how important to your home audience, who you're writing for, is this particular story. And it will also depend a lot on what else is going on in the news on any given day. You know, when something really big happens, when I first moved to Nairobi, it was the day that I left London was September the 11th, and I got to Nairobi and we weren't allowed to write anything for about 3 weeks, even though lots of important things were happening, because the world was only interested in one story. So the news agenda elsewhere also has a big impact on, you know, how much play a story might get. So we're thinking of all those sorts of things with our journalists' heads on.
You say that you don't necessarily have a sixth sense about how something about to arrive, but how quickly are you able to predict how big a story something is going to become? Does a sense, a previous experience kick in there, that you can actually say, well, this is going to be big?
Yeah, it can do. I mean, in really crude terms, if you're thinking about sort of attacks, terrorist attacks or attacks during a time of conflict, it can do just in the sense that a very quick visual of a site as you arrive will let you know how big an incident this has been. Other things can happen. Those stories move fast. So with the Mombasa bombings that I mentioned earlier, it was by sort of terrorist attack standards not an enormous attack. It was, I think, 13 people were killed, lots wounded. But what became the story there was the investigation that followed. It was an attack on an Israeli-owned hotel, and at the same time, an Israeli plane that was, I think it had 230 or 250 Israeli passengers on board flying back to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, was targeted but missed. And so the story actually evolved and became much bigger. Initially, there was a story around the attack, but then over the next week, I found myself covering a very complex Kenyan police investigation and the investigation back in Israel. And so sometimes stories can, and that kind of thing is very difficult to foresee. So yes, we can understand, we can sort of gauge from experience, especially as we arrive somewhere, sort of if this is likely to be a big deal or not. But then there are also all sorts of other factors that could come to play that can change a story and make it much bigger than it initially was. And those things are difficult to predict.
I remember reading that Woodward and Bernstein spotted that Watergate was going to be a big story because of the seniority of the FBI personnel who turned up to the first hearing about the break-in, which was...
It's a really good point as well. So for investigative reporting, where you've been working on a particular beat for a long time in a very similar way, so you've been working on particular topic areas and you become a total specialist in that area. And so things that to other people would pass unnoticed, for example, the value of the particular source that has given you information, you might have a sense then of if they're saying this is really important. And definitely as you become, the more specialist and experienced you become in any field, the more you'll get a very quick feel for whether something is important or not.
If you want to ask a question, do stick your hand up. I've got a few more that I can ask in the meantime. You talked about, movingly actually, about building up relationships with ordinary people and that your own compassion being engaged by this. But of course you develop a relationship and then you move on. And I just wondered how it feels to have developed this relationship in order to get really good content to share with readers and with viewers. But do people try to keep in touch with you? How do you feel personally about having developed these relationships and then no longer being there?
So it's a really good question. I mean, in terms of the relationships we build with sources, often they're all too fleeting. As a foreign correspondent, if you're coming, especially when you're sort of traveling to a country you don't live in and just spending a short amount of time there. Sometimes I've had people keep in touch with me. I'm always open to that. That's fine. But it's quite a rare thing because you're usually there giving, for a day, 2 days, a week maximum, and speaking to a huge amount of people during that time. But yes, we, sources, our contact books are the sort of essential is the key document that all journalists have. So we're always interested in keeping in touch with people if we can. In terms of leaving, though, personally, it's one of the things I've always found hardest when covering difficult stories, is that knowledge all the way through before you even leave is that you are covering the lives of people who don't have a chance to get away at the end of the day. However hard it might be on a physical level, on a human level, on an emotional level for you as a journalist to cover a particular thing, you do have a ticket out, and all being well, you will get on a plane or a train at the end of the assignment and go back to a much more privileged life. And I think that is a really difficult thing to deal with, and I think a lot of us deal with it not particularly well. It takes a lot of time to try and reconcile yourself to that fact that you're living with a foot in two different worlds in effect, and I think the adjustment between those two worlds can be quite difficult.
Okay, one final question from me, which is you touched on journalism and power. What happens, well, first, actually, it's two sub-questions, really. Your own attitudes. If you are interviewing somebody who you don't agree with, how does that impact on the way you do it? And what happens if you are aware that they are just not telling you the truth? What responsibility does a journalist have to expose this on the grounds that, on the basis that actually you might not get another interview if you do it over brutally?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, and there aren't any right answers in that. It's a constant balance between knowing what you need in the long term and knowing what you need today. I think Emily Maitlis is quite good on this when she talks about her interview with Trump, or her interviews with Trump, and how with hindsight she feels that she probably should have called him out on a lot more of the lies that at the time seemed quite almost banal and if not benign, but sort of, they seemed unimportant in the context of where he was then, and of course in the context of what's gone on to happen seem much more important now. I think your own opinions on any given person are something that you try to put aside in the interview context. I mean, when you do a big interview, you spend a lot of time preparing and reading round, and there's an awful lot. What you see on screen or in a newspaper is just the tip of a very big iceberg. The vast majority of the work we do as journalists is always behind the scenes. And hopefully in that process, you discover a bit more than your own opinions. And hopefully, if you do have opinions there, based on facts and research, and actually probably something that needs to be put to this person. So while your own your own biases don't belong in an interview room. Having an opinion is okay, which we're supposed to as well. We're supposed to have a rational, researched, fact-based opinion, and that is what needs to be put to anybody to challenge. And as long as you let them have their say back, I think that's probably a good thing. If you feel someone is lying, yeah, absolutely, it's your responsibility to try and get them to tell the truth. While trying at the same time not to appear rude or not to interrupt. You are there ultimately as a conduit to their voice, not so that your own voice would be heard. And often I think we see interviewers get that balance slightly wrong, where they're more interested in sort of the challenge than in the response, and ultimately the response has to be more interesting. But yeah, these are really difficult things, and they're difficult things particularly because we're working under time pressure. And we're working in a situation which is changing all the time. You don't get to do it a second time afterwards, so however well you've planned, things may not go according to plan, and you're having to think on your feet. That's where preparation comes in, and experience. The more preparation you can do, the better. The more facts you have at your disposal, you can always tell. If you go into an interview underprepared, and we've all done that plenty of times as well, it's never as effective as it could be.
The iceberg analogy is a good one. One of the things that interested me most about the book is Emily Maitlis is the visible face of Newsnight, but actually this vast infrastructure that's feeding information and editing, and that was really interesting in the book.
Particularly in television news, yeah, that's very much the case. I can see a hand raised.
Yes, it's Pete Finn, who in fact is next week's lecturer, their lecture speaker. So he's a politics lecturer. Pete, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, so thanks for a really interesting talk, Fiona. And kind of, I guess, as a bit of a bridge to what I'm talking about next week, I was thinking as you were talking about Trump and about journalism and kind of attacks on journalism as a craft, and the idea that sort of journalism holding power to account should have a role in society. And that how do you deal with that as a journalist, and then how, as an academic now, when you're teaching, do you you must discuss it with your students, right? I mean, if journalism isn't there to hold power to account, right, what's the point? So I just wondered if you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I mean, it's very much. I teach one module on the undergraduate degree actually about sort of the history of journalism in Britain, and one of the things we look at is how this idea came about. It wasn't there at the sort of birth, as it were, of journalism, but where this idea came from, and it's got very deep roots, this idea that journalism is there to hold power to account. As with all of these concepts, it's always a bit grayer, muzzier than you'd perhaps like, but it is definitely central to what we do. And in the current climate, I agree, it's particularly important to think about it, because there is such a loss of trust in journalism. That's another whole discussion, but there's so many attacks on journalists and on journalism, and I think it's really important that we help our students understand why they're there. On the masters, we actually have a whole module which is dedicated, it's called Journalism and Power, and it's dedicated to understanding the structures of governments, understanding how councils work, how local courts work, how international structures work, so that journalists equipped properly with that knowledge are then able to hold power to account in all the different ways that are available to us. So yeah, I think it's really important that we discuss these things with our students and help them to understand. It's a difficult climate in Britain. I mean, it depends a lot, obviously, in what sort of journalism incoming students have been exposed to or familiar with. But we have a very unusual press here, which swathes of which aren't sort of primarily there to hold power to account. If you look at the American press, for example, you'd get a very different idea of always has been much more sort of straight-laced and serious than ours, which has its ours has its plus points, but it has a lot of negative ones as well, and particularly fueling the sort of current climate of criticizing journalism.
Thank you. So we've got some questions coming in about you personally, about your personal response to things. So Daisy has asked if you've ever felt, in fear for your life.
Hi Daisy. The answer is yes. And if I'd had this conversation with you a few months ago, I probably would have said no. But really interestingly, I just took part in a research project, and I'm not the researcher, somebody else is doing a piece of academic work around the trauma experienced by conflict reporters, and I was one of their interviewees, and my old Baghdad bureau chief was on the call as well, because he's part of the team doing this. And as we talked, he said, but do you remember when this happened? And do you remember when that happened? And it turns out, yeah, there have been several occasions where my car was followed in Iraq once at a time when lots of journalists were being abducted. My car hit a car bomb another time. There are various instances where things were close. I think the answer really is that in the moment, I've also lost lots of colleagues, I should say, especially in Iraq, but elsewhere too. So yeah, I'm very aware, was very aware when I was in that particular environment, that the line is very thin. I think when things are actually happening as a the sort of combination of adrenaline, and also, we are trained in coping with hostile environments as well. We have, I went on a course, before I went to any of these parts of the world, sort of trained by Marines into how to deal with particular situations, how to plan for them. And that sort of training does kick in. So I think as events are unfolding, you're not necessarily paralyzed by fear, or you do have an idea, you know what to do just then, or at least you know something to do. It might turn out that you did the wrong thing, but you have a sense of action. And it's really only later, when you have a little bit of remove, that you start to think about what actually happened.
Gosh, right. Okay, well, actually, leading on from that, Caroline has asked a question about, and it goes back really to the routine that you get into, of being able to acknowledge how big the bomb that you hear going off is. Do you get an empathy fatigue? Do you run out of feeling empathy because your practical responses to how big a threat is this are so overwhelming?
So I don't think so, because such a big part of the job is talking to people caught up in these things. So usually, let me tell you a sort of typical scenario. You'll go to the scene of a bomb, and you'll spend a bit of time there speaking to, officials, police, whatever, trying to work out any witnesses, that kind of thing. And the next step is that you'll typically go to hospitals and find out who's there. You'll find out which hospitals people are admitted to, and through all of this reporting, you're talking to families, you're talking to witnesses, you're talking to people whose loss is much more tangible than yours. You're affected by the things you see to some extent, but you're there as an observer fundamentally. So I think it's almost, well, for me anyway, again, perhaps these things are very personal. I think as a text reporter, I don't think that lack of empathy was ever an issue. I think I felt very closely tied to the people who were living these things. And if anything, I'd say that my problem might have been the other extreme, that sometimes I needed to get away to get a bit more distance. When I was in Iraq, I don't know if you know, but so in Iraq, during the Iraq conflict in 2003, reporters were split into two groups effectively. You were either embedded, which meant you lived with either the British or the American army and covered things from within the military, or you were what they called unilateral, which was that you weren't. And as an Arabic speaker, I was always independent, because the main value I could add to the file was that I could speak to people and go and sort of tell the civilian side, which suited me very well. But at some stage, because you can't help when you're seeing the impact of this conflict on individuals, you can't help but build up a huge anger yourself towards what's happening. There was huge injustices taking place on a daily basis. And so I actually asked, for example, to go and be embedded, because I felt it was really important for me to see the other side of the story for a while as well. To try and feel empathy for the other side, as it were. So yeah, for me, that was that. If anything, I tended towards. I do think these things are a bit personal to some extent. I know also, speaking to colleagues, sometimes people who work behind cameras, whether photojournalists or television camera people, have a slightly different relationship to the stories because of the physical distance of a lens. So that's a very different experience. For example, even though you're covering the same stories, that gives you a very different outlook on them than somebody like me, who would be, invited into people's homes and have to sit and chat and really, shown old photos and sort of really drawn into the dramas in a way that perhaps you aren't if you're behind a camera. So that could also have an impact potentially.
Thank you very much. Just responding to a couple of things in the chat. Yes, we are recording this, so a recording will be made available. And also a link has just been posted and will be available on the Kingston website to that recording, and also to Pete's talk next week. So let's move on to empathy of your family, because I can see that what you're describing is just completely engrossing, but it must be quite annoying to live with, because if your mind is always somewhere else and you're constantly missing family events because you're somewhere else, And in fact, Lindsay has asked the question of, I remember in the book, it centres around a llama park, doesn't it? That she's trying to get back to be with her family for this experience of linking everybody together. So can we respond to Lindsay's point about, do you ever feel guilt for being so engrossed and presumably being present but mentally somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big question. So when I was doing this kind of reporting, I was in my 20s and early 30s. I was unattached, or no children, at least, no sort of no real reason not to be able to travel when I wanted to and when I could. Nonetheless, I think it was hugely inconvenient for my family sometimes. I remember one occasion where my brother I lived in Kenya, and my brother and his girlfriend had flown out to have a holiday in Kenya. And I took them to this beautiful Lake Naivasha, and we were going to camp. And as we pulled into Lake Naivasha, my phone rang. And my editor said, I know you took holiday, but war's just broken out in Ivory Coast. I need you to go today. And I did. And I left them. And they had a lovely holiday, but they didn't have the holiday that I really owed to them, having lured them all the way out to Kenya. And I think that sort of thing must be immensely frustrating and difficult. For me personally, at the point where I had a child, I'm a single parent as well. So that sort of made things even clearer. I decided that I can't do that kind of journalism anymore. Because for me, that level of responsibility was something that I couldn't combine. Interestingly, and I thought for me, again, as a single parent with making those kinds of decisions, I found it interesting how supportive Emily Maitlis's partner, husband, I think, was. And I think the majority, so not all by any means, but the majority of journalists in those kinds of jobs are men, because if they have families, they have a wife at home who is taking the bulk of the care role. In this case, perhaps that's reversed, and I think you need a very understanding partner and family as well. Again, this is a book that's almost all situated when her children are a little bit older. It would be interesting to know how she coped with that when they were younger, and perhaps the answer is that she didn't travel so much. But certainly there's compromise, and not just for you, but for families involved. I remember as well having to lie to family. My grandmother was quite old when I was she was in her 90s when I was in Iraq, and I remember I lied to her entirely and told her I didn't go anywhere near it. And I remember standing in the garden in our office in Baghdad, pretending I was in Kenya, and then there'd sort of be a bomb going off, and you'd have to make up some reason for why there was a loud explosion on the call, even though you were in your garden in Nairobi, and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's tough for families. It's tough for families, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. And you mentioned that you're now based in the UK. You came back when you had a child. So presumably, going back to the point I made about building up relationships, you no longer flew home from them, did you? So once you're covering stories in the UK, you're much more accessible. Did that raise any issues about people wanting to continue things?
No, I mean, for me personally, once I moved back to the UK, I took a role as an editor. Right. So I had journalists out in the Gulf who were covering stories, and I wrote sort of more, analytical pieces, or pieces that could be done from a distance. So no, I haven't had that sort of exposure to those kinds of breaking news assignments or sort of some of the more hectic end of the scale since I had my daughter, which was a choice. I mean, it was a difficult choice to make in lots of ways, but it was a very sort of deliberate choice that I personally made.
Okay. Another question. I mean, you've talked, obviously your empathy hasn't run out, but you've mentioned very much not so. And you've mentioned that for some people that having the lens in between you and the audience actually does cut you off. Are there any interesting sort of empathy refresher things that journalists, are there behaviours or hobbies that correlate with empathy refreshing for journalists? I mean, this is a great generalization, but do they like to cook? Do they like to knit? What do they do to kind of feel human again when they've been dealing with awful situations?
I think the answer is that journalists like to drink, Alison, sadly. No, I think, again, I think this is quite a personal thing. I think it depends on how you recharge your batteries. For me, it was always getting away from everything. And I took it to the most extreme, where after one particularly difficult assignment, it was the best thing I ever did, I think, I decided to learn how to dive. Because going back to your point about, you know, the phone ringing in the middle of the night and do you have a sixth sense, I worked out that the only place where my phone couldn't ring and call me somewhere was when I was 20 meters underwater. So I literally went to stay in a hotel. I was the only person staying in a hotel on the Kenyan coast for a few days, and then a friend joined me, and it was bliss, you know. So for me, it was always getting away from everything, actually being able to, you know, go out to the bush somewhere, be somewhere ideally out of range, write in a way that wasn't news, you know, write diaries, read, listen to music. So those are the things that sort of feed my soul. But I suspect everyone's quite different. Other people, I've got lots of friends who used to go sort of on motorbike trips, you know, spend time with family. So I suppose it's a very individual thing, isn't it? But yeah, you do need to find ways to recharge your batteries for sure. So some way of kind of counterbalancing, because it's that type of journalism, again, this is one particular type of journalism, there are many, but is a very adrenaline fueled one, and you do need to obviously have some sort of moments of detox as well, and some time to unwind.
Is there anything you wouldn't leave home without, that's a comfort thing that you would always ensure you had with you?
Good question. So I never go anywhere, even now, without a pen and paper. It's a notebook and
that's professional. Give me something personal.
But no, it's personal. I mean, as a diary, I don't mean as a journalist kind of thing, but somewhere to note stuff that interests me or that I see, or you know. And I suppose the other thing that I never travelled without was, in the very, very old days, it would have been a Walkman. Now it'd be an MP3 player, like a supply of music that I can listen to and just block out everything if I need to. So those are my things, again, that, yeah, probably those would be the two.
And we had a family discussion recently about travelling, and there was a discussion that arose over, I mean, I never go anywhere without a bottle of TCP, because I think it's really good stuff. And the woman I was talking to said, no, Germaline. So is there any medical product that you, because for me, TCP, you can gargle with it, which I think it has an advantage over Germaline. Is there anything you'd recommend?
In conflict zones, I mean, we used to have a giant medical aid kit which we had to take with us, which had all sorts of things that you wouldn't need in normal life. So that always came with me. In normal travels, what do I travel with? I don't know. It's a good question.
Oh, well, you can.
I like my expandable travel washing line, to be honest. It's not in the sort of first aid thing, but I've got one of these things you can stick up anywhere. You put one, it's got these little suction pads, and you can put it across a room or a bathroom anywhere and dry your laundry. That's quite useful.
Gosh, that's a great answer. Don't own one of those. Sarah has asked if you miss the buzz of the 2 a.m. wake up now that you're living a life of you've become a lecturer and an editor. So do you miss it?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, not all the time. And I think probably not very much just in the same way that I miss being young. You know, I don't think it's not something that I wish I was still doing in lots of ways. But I think the main time, it hasn't happened very often, but when certain big events happen, I just really, really wish I was there covering them. I think the first big one after I had my daughter, when my daughter was tiny, the so-called Arab Spring happened, and you know, as an Arabist and as someone who was specializing in the Middle East, like I just felt like I ought to be there, and I was watching the scenes come from Tahrir Square in Cairo and making my 9-month-old daughter watch this and feeling like I really ought to be there. And occasionally those big things happen where I wish I was covering them, but that's not to say rational me wishes I was still doing it. It was the right time in my life to stop. But yeah, definitely there are times when I miss the buzz, for sure. It's a great job, it's an extraordinary thing to be doing, and you are in such a position of privilege. I saw incredible things happen and was able to meet extraordinary people, and that's of course something I miss.
Is there anybody you'd really like to meet, to interview?
Who would I meet to interview? Lots of people. My biggest regret is that the worst interview I ever did, well, it wasn't an interview at all, when I was a tiny young junior reporter. It was on my first foreign assignment. I was sent to Burundi to cover peace talks, which were being there was a war in Burundi that was sort of slowly coming to an end, and Nelson Mandela had organized these peace talks, and all these leaders were flying in. And I found myself standing with other reporters. It wasn't like a one-on-one interview situation, but in the airport in Bujumbura, the capital of Burundi. And there came Nelson Mandela, and he stood a meter from me, half like really squashed up. and I was so in awe I didn't even manage to say a word. I couldn't. It's the only time in my life I've been reduced to silence, but completely pathetic. And luckily there were more experienced journalists around me who asked the questions that I could then, it was a communal kind of event, so I could still have quotes for my story. But I've always kicked myself over that, like, what an opportunity missed.
I had a similar experience in the green room at the Cheltenham Festival when I ran into Emma Thompson, who I have a massive admiration for, and I just gazed at her. I couldn't think of a thing to say, which doesn't often happen.
No.
We teach creative writing at Kingston, as you know, and from the publishing department, we talk to them about, accessing the best time of their brain when they really feel that they're making sure that when their brain is working well, that's when they prioritize their writing. They don't use it to answer their emails. But a journalist, you have to write whenever required, particularly in the situation you're in. So is it just that the adrenaline kicks in and you've got to do it, so you do, or what?
So I'd say, again, I think everyone's creative processes are different, but I'd say there's different types of stories. So yeah, I mean, I've written everywhere. I've had to write crouched in the back of a, Sudanese rebel plane before because I had to file within half an hour. I've had to everywhere. But those kinds of stories, I'm not looking for any great sort of turn of phrase, or it doesn't need to be lyrical or beautiful. It just needs to convey the news. And again, that's where training comes in. Even on the MA, we drill students in how to write an intro, where to put the quote, and that stuff is just instinct, and you could do that anywhere. You could do it, standing on your head. And so obviously in difficult circumstances that becomes harder, you're under pressure, whatever, but you can do that. If I want to write something better, if I want to write a feature, or if I want to write an interview in a sort of elegant way, I will always, it's never time pressing then, and I will always take some time over it and find the quiet moment when I can actually think straight and sit and think and really plan my words. So yeah, I think that still applies. Perhaps you don't have quite as much choice over what time of day, but certainly I'd make sure that I had a bit of space mentally to do the good writing. So
the more thoughtful pieces, that when you're reflecting on what's happened, you try and access that good brain time.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting question come in from Caroline, which is that you've covered a lot of wars, and she's a pacifist, and is there a gender divide here? Are wars mostly started by men, and the military is, your interesting question, actually. Those covering them, are they mostly men or mostly a mixture? And do you have any advice on promoting peace rather than war, even though your stock in trade has been reporting war?
Yeah, I mean, I think this hour has probably been a bit deceptive that I've covered a lot of conflict, but I've probably covered more peace talks than I have conflict as well. Like, I've covered a lot of other things as well. In terms of the male female, so in terms of reporters, yeah, really interesting question. There's lots of, I have a lot of friends who are female reporters doing incredible jobs in all sorts of places, covering a wide range of topics. It is nonetheless true that, I can think of occasions when in the Baghdad office, for example, it was a fairly sizable bureau at the height of the war. And there may have been 15 or 16 of us there, and I would be the only woman. So yes, male dominated, definitely still. I think that has a lot to do with the previous question about family circumstances, etc. How to promote peace? I mean, I ended up working at the United Nations. Perhaps that's slightly related to the question, and working in sort of more development kind of stuff, writing and editing about post-conflict situations. I spent a lot of time covering post-conflict stories as well, and I suppose only from a journalist perspective, just to say, yeah, that we need to cover those stories as well as assiduously as we cover conflict. So I spent a lot of time in post-genocide Rwanda writing about programs of justice or rebuilding or economic development or all of these things, and perhaps that's the fault of public interest as much as anything else. But yeah, we need to find outlets for people to read about these things as well. And war has always captured the headlines. Go right back to sort of the earliest days of journalism and the sort of concoction of conflicts which didn't even really exist in Southern America just to sell newspapers. And that's sort of the appetites of the press in the sort of, on an ownership level and on a readership level, perhaps more to blame than the journalists who are producing the stories. But certainly that's a societal problem, isn't it? That we are more interested in the conflicts than in the solutions, obviously, often.
quite a lot of them. It's worth saying actually that Airhead, we started off with Fiona. Fiona's a journalist from the Department of Journalism, Publishing and Media. But the book that we choose for our big read isn't meant to be discipline specific. It's meant to have material that appeals to or could be read with interest, but by absolutely everybody across the institution. And so the remainder of the programme that is to come is being given by colleagues like Fiona, but in a complete range of disciplines. So we've got people from business studies, from politics, from health and well-being, because actually there's a lot in Airhead about keeping healthy. And she always takes her running gear wherever she goes, doesn't she? So it's a very balanced programme, and the talks will relate to the book in all sorts of contexts. But from your role as a journalist, and I know a lot of journalist students are actually listening, is there anything you'd like to say to them, Fiona, by way of welcome?
Oh, to incoming journalism students?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, just a huge welcome to the department. We're thrilled to have you. And yeah, I think, you know, when I started out, I wasn't so fortunate as to do a course in journalism before I began. I absolutely fell in at the deep end, which is one way to learn. But I often think now, teaching the way we do, where we sort of are able not just to teach the drills, but also to give a really some time and sort of perspective and get people thinking about big questions like ethics and law and journalism and power and, you know, all these kinds of big questions. And I often feel quite envious that you guys get to think those things through before we launch you at the field. So I think that's a really great thing.
Great. And the very varied list of speakers that we've got over the weeks to come, I think, indicates the variety of things that are taught at Kingston and how we are a joined up community. I mean, seeing all the names flash past of the various departments, we've got quite a few staff listening in today. So perhaps I can just close by thanking you very much. That's been really insightful. I mean, we're in the same department and I've learned much more about what you do from the past 50 minutes than I knew before. I think it's been really exciting, actually. Do tune in again next week. Next week it's at 5 o'clock and it'll be Pete Finn talking about US politics. He's a big expert on that. If you want to read the relevant chapters, there's the chapter on Donald Trump. There's a chapter on 2 days with Bill Clinton when she travels around with President Clinton in the back of a car. And there's also, again, referring back to what Fiona started with, which is the 2 a.m. wake up, that she's just conducted an interview in the White House. And she's crossing the White House lawn and she runs into Anthony Scaramucci, who was then, I mean, he was quite briefly the White House communications director, and she spots him and literally runs over with her team and says, can I do an interview? So that's the sort of on the spur of the moment, being ready to take action. If you want to access this, it will be available to you, a recording, if you want to play it in detail and listen to Fiona's very thoughtful answers in more detail. That's great. But in the meantime, thanks so much for coming in. It's great to see this, our first talk, has drawn such a big audience. And thanks very much for taking part, everybody. Over and out.